On November 30th, 2013, the illusion shattered on a street in Santa Clarita. Paul Walker, the man millions associated with speed, loyalty, and impossible escapes, was gone in a crash so violent it felt less like news than a scene the world refused to believe was real. He was 40 years old, riding in a Porsche after attending a charity event for Reach Out Worldwide, the disaster relief organization he had founded after Haiti. Then came the impact, the fire, the smoke, the flashing headlines, the stunned silence. Fans reread the words. News anchors repeated his name as if saying it more carefully might somehow change the ending. But nothing changed. The face that had spent years racing through one of the world's biggest action franchises had been stopped forever on an ordinary California afternoon. Reuters reported that Walker was a passenger in a Porsche Carrera GT driven by Roger Rodas, and that both men died after the car struck a light pole and tree and burst into flames. The same investigation later concluded the crash was caused by unsafe speed, not mechanical failure, which made the tragedy feel even more brutal. There was no hidden twist, no last-minute miracle, no cinematic escape waiting at the edge of the road. What made the shock even crueler was the contradiction at its center. Paul Walker was not just a famous actor. For a generation that had grown up watching him drive through chaos with effortless calm, the idea that a real road had taken him felt almost obscene. It was too literal, too cruel, too perfectly shaped to become instant legend in the mind. He was Brian O'Connor, the calm, loyal heart inside a franchise built on speed, engines, danger, and survival. On screen, he had escaped wrecks, outrun disaster, and become part of a global mythology where the road always seemed to lead somewhere bigger. Off-screen, he was also known for something quieter: service, humility, and the relief work he personally funded and joined through Reach Out Worldwide. The official ROWW site says he was involved in every part of the organization, from deployments to fully funding its work before his death. That detail makes the ending feel even colder. He did not die after a scandal, a downfall, or a long public collapse. He died on a day connected to helping others. And maybe that is why the loss hit so hard. The world did not just lose a movie star that day. It lost a man who looked built for motion, built for sunlight, built to keep going. Reuters later noted that his death reshaped the emotional core of Furious 7, turning his final screen appearance into something memorial, almost impossible to separate from grief. Fans gathered by the thousands at the crash site not long after, transforming the road into a vigil of flowers, engines, tears, and disbelief. Before he became flowers at a crash site, a tribute song, and a face people still associate with unfinished roads, Paul Walker was just a California boy with a very different life waiting behind the myth. Long before the world turned Paul Walker into a symbol of speed, he belonged to a much quieter California story. He was born in Glendale on September 12, 1973, and began appearing in front of cameras while he was still a child, first through modeling and commercials, then through small television roles. One of the strangest things about looking back at Paul Walker's early life is how little it resembles the image most people carry now. He was not born inside roaring engines, nighttime highways, or the mythology of danger that would later define him. He came from the bright suburban side of Southern California: sunshine, family routines, and the kind of all-American good looks that made people notice him early. But even before fame, there was already something else about him that matters for this story. He did not seem built entirely for Hollywood. Acting was there from the beginning, yes, but it did not feel like the only thing that made him alive. What made the shock even crueler was the contradiction at its center. Paul Walker was not just a famous actor. For a generation that had grown up watching him drive through chaos with effortless calm, the idea that a real road had taken him felt almost obscene. It was too literal, too cruel, too perfectly shaped to become instant legend in the mind. He was Brian O'Connor, the calm, loyal heart inside a franchise built on speed, engines, danger, and survival. On screen, he had escaped wrecks, outrun disaster, and become part of a global mythology where the road always seemed to lead somewhere bigger. Off-screen, he was also known for something quieter: service, humility, and the relief work he personally funded and joined through Reach Out Worldwide. The official ROWW site says he was involved in every part of the organization, from deployments to fully funding its work before his death. That detail makes the ending feel even colder. He did not die after a scandal, a downfall, or a long public collapse. He died on a day connected to helping others. And maybe that is why the loss hit so hard. The world did not just lose a movie star that day. It lost a man who looked built for motion, built for sunlight, built to keep going. It means that before he became the man audiences connected with cars, action, and impossible cinematic survival, There was a version of him that seemed drawn toward nature, research, and a life less artificial than the one Hollywood eventually gave him. That is what makes Paul Walker different from many stars whose entire identity appears to have been built inside fame. With him, you can still feel another self beneath the image. The surfer, the ocean lover, the California boy who looked more at home near sunlight and water than inside the machinery of celebrity. And maybe that is why his ending feels so cruel in retrospect. Before the world made him immortal through speed, it had briefly been handed someone who seemed almost too grounded, too healthy, too naturally alive to become the subject of a tragedy like that. Monterey Bay Aquarium described him after his death as a lifelong friend of the ocean, and reports at the time noted that he had studied marine biology and remained deeply connected to that passion even after becoming famous. By the late 1990s, Paul Walker was already working steadily, but fame had not yet locked him into a single image. He was the kind of actor people noticed immediately. Athletic, open-faced, easy to watch, carrying a clean warmth that felt different from the darker, sharper masculinity Hollywood often sold. Then came The Fast and the Furious in 2001, and everything changed. As Brian O'Connor, Walker became the emotional engine of a franchise built on speed, danger, adrenaline, and loyalty. He was not the loudest presence on screen, and that was part of why he mattered. Around bigger personalities and louder performances, Paul Walker brought calm. He made the chaos feel human. Audiences did not only believe him as a man behind the wheel, they believed him as someone they could trust inside the noise. That quality turned him into more than an action star. It made him accessible. As the franchise expanded, so did his place inside global pop culture. Reuters later noted that his death reshaped the emotional core of Furious 7, proving how deeply his presence had become tied to the heart of the series, while Britannica describes Fast and Furious as a worldwide phenomenon that grew far beyond a simple street racing film. By then, Paul Walker was no longer just an actor with a recognizable face. He had become one of the world's clearest modern images of motion, loyalty, brotherhood, and cinematic speed. Before the franchise defined him completely, films like Pleasantville, Varsity Blues, and She's All That had already shown why cameras stayed with him so easily. He combined movie star beauty with an almost unguarded softness, making him appear neither unreachable nor cynical, but like someone fame had found before it had hardened him. But that image only explains part of why people loved him. Plenty of actors become famous through blockbuster franchises and still feel distant once the credits roll. Paul Walker did not. The public saw beauty, yes, but also sincerity. He seemed less manufactured than many stars, less hungry to dominate attention, less artificial in the way he carried fame. That made him unusually easy to project goodness onto. Fans did not simply admire Brian O'Connor, they folded Paul Walker into that same emotional space, as if the loyalty, decency, and steadiness of the character belonged to the man as well. In many ways, that was the foundation of his legend. He was the rare kind of celebrity whose fame felt fast, but whose image felt clean. Yet that is also where the shadow quietly began. The larger the Fast and Furious mythology became, the more tightly the world fused Paul Walker with roads, engines, speed, and survival. He was becoming not just a performer inside a machine, but a face that represented the fantasy of outrunning disaster itself. And that is what makes this part of the story so important. Before the crash in Part 1 became the ending people could never forget, Paul Walker had already become a symbol the public thought would keep moving forever. Too handsome, too calm, too physically alive to be imagined in stillness. That illusion would make the tragedy far worse when it finally broke. By the time Paul Walker had become one of the defining faces of Fast and Furious, the public had already fused him with a very specific mythology. He was no longer just an actor people recognized from posters, premieres, and action scenes. He had become part of a larger fantasy about speed itself. On screen, he drove through danger as if the road would always make room for him. He belonged to a world of roaring engines, impossible escapes, shattered glass, loyalty under pressure, and motion that never truly stopped. But the deeper tragedy of Paul Walker's story is that this image was never the whole truth. Behind the franchise, behind the cars, and behind the calm intensity that made him feel almost untouchable, there was a man whose life was not built only around adrenaline. He cared about the ocean. He cared about service. He cared enough about human suffering to create Reach Out worldwide after disaster struck Haiti, and he did not treat that work like a celebrity accessory. He showed up for it. That detail changes the emotional center of his story. The world remembers the speed first, because that was the image it loved most. But the man himself was larger and quieter than the myth built around him. He was not just the face of cinematic motion. He was also someone with a groundedness that made the eventual ending feel even crueler. The distance between those two versions of Paul Walker, the icon of velocity and the man trying to do good in the real world, is where the real sadness begins. It is also where the script must slow down, because without that contrast, his death becomes shocking, but not truly devastating at all. That sadness deepens because of the way his final day now reads in hindsight. Paul Walker did not die at the end of a scandal, a public collapse, or a long season of visible self-destruction. He died after attending an event connected to charity, on a day that should have ended in ordinary goodwill, not fire and metal and headlines. That fact gives his story an especially cold kind of irony. The public had spent years watching him survive cinematic danger, only to lose him in a real car crash that felt unbearably literal. It was as if the image that made him beloved turned against him in the most final way possible. And maybe that is why his death still lingers with such force. It was not only sudden, it felt symbolically cruel. Paul Walker had become a global emblem of movement, youth, brotherhood, and speed, and then a road stopped him forever. There would be no graceful fading, no reinvention, no older version of the man reflecting back on the character that made him famous. The mythology was sealed in violence. That is what makes this part of his story so haunting. The road, the engines, the rush, the freedom, the escape. All the things that once made his image feel larger than life now lead backward to the same unbearable conclusion. In the end, Paul Walker was not destroyed by inner chaos the public had watched unfold for years. He was taken by a fate that seemed to borrow the very language of his legend. And that is why the loss still feels unreal. The man who looked built to keep moving was suddenly reduced to silence, and the world was left staring at the wreckage of a myth it thought could outrun anything. After Paul Walker was gone, the grief did not stay abstract for long. It gathered in places people could actually see. It gathered in flowers laid at the crash site, in candles burning beside photographs, in fans standing silently near scorched pavement as if a road they had never cared about before had suddenly become sacred. That is one of the strangest things about a shocking death. Ordinary places are transformed by loss. A street becomes a memorial. A headline becomes a wound. A face once linked to thrill and escape becomes inseparable from mourning. In the days that followed, people did not grieve Paul Walker only as a movie star. They grieved him as someone who had lived inside their memories for years without ever feeling unreachable. That was part of what made the sorrow so immediate. He had never seemed cold, theatrical, or protected by the kind of celebrity distance that keeps audiences at arm's length. He felt open, familiar, good. And because of that, his death did not land like the collapse of an untouchable icon. It landed like the disappearance of someone the world had quietly trusted. The crash site memorial, the endless tribute videos, the flood of old interviews and scenes shared online, all of it revealed the same truth. People were not only mourning the end of a career, they were mourning the loss of a certain kind of presence, a man who had carried speed without arrogance, fame without visible cruelty, and masculinity without feeling hard or unreachable. That is why the silence after his death felt so different. It was not just the silence left by a famous voice going quiet. It was the silence left when a person who seemed built for movement is suddenly gone, and all that motion collapses into memory. That memory only deepened as the world looked back. Fast and Furious no longer felt like just a franchise about cars, brotherhood, and action. After Paul Walker's death, it became something else too. A place where fans returned to hear his voice again, watch his face again, and feel the ache of a man still alive on screen but gone everywhere else. The final farewell attached to his legacy hit so hard because it did not feel manufactured. It felt earned. People had spent years watching him race toward danger and come out the other side. When reality refused to give him that same escape, the mythology of Paul Walker changed forever. He was no longer only Brian O'Connor, the calm center inside chaos. He became a reminder that even the faces we associate most strongly with survival can disappear without warning. But maybe that is not the whole ending. Because what Paul Walker left behind was not only sadness, he left behind a kind of warmth that grief could not erase. The charity work, the stories people told about his kindness, the footage that showed him laughing without effort, the way his image still feels sunlit even when placed beside tragedy. All of that became part of the reason people remember him with such tenderness. He did not leave the world as someone destroyed by scandal or consumed by bitterness. He left as someone still carrying the image of possibility. And maybe that is why his loss remains so painful. It was not the ending of a man who already looked broken. It was the ending of someone who still seemed in motion, still seemed bright, still seemed like he had farther to go. In the end, Paul Walker did not just leave behind films, posters, and a franchise built on speed. He left behind the feeling of an unfinished road, one the world still looks at now and then, as if part of him might somehow still be coming around the next turn.